All right, so business processes. All right, our next topic, we're going to talk about approval processes. We're going to talk about time-dependent workflow. And yes, so let's jump into it. Multi-step approval processes. One of the things that our Universal Containers organization would like to do is to have an approval process whereby anytime that a hiring manager creates a position, they're going to submit that position to recruiters and some VPs to have it approved before we can then start accepting job applications, before their recruiters start doing their thing. Okay? So we're going to use approval processes to be able to facilitate that process whereby people will log in and sign off on these positions. All right, the way that approval processes work is that when a user clicks on a Submit for Approval button, we will evaluate whether this record meets the criteria for the approval process. So a user conceivably can click on that Submit for Approval button associated with a record, and it might not meet the requirements, and it might simply say no approval processes meet the entry criteria for the record that you're submitting. So maybe one of the things that we do is we have not just one sort of a beginning and end, but maybe there's a new, and then we need to put it in a status that it's now ready to be approved, and then we submit it for approval so that it will then be marked as approved or marked as rejected. But that sort of ready state, maybe we're checking to make sure that it's ready for someone to approve it. We can define that within our entry criteria. Okay. There are initial submission actions. Initial submission actions are actions that we immediately perform. Okay. One of the default ones is to lock the record. So lock the record which is being submitted for approval so that a user doesn't say, I submitted this and now I'm going to go and start changing stuff halfway through the approval process. Don't want to let that happen. There are one or many approval steps. And then after we've completed the approval steps, now approval steps, what is an approval step? An approval step is where one or many people are required to approve it or reject it. Okay, so if we have a three-step process, that means either three people or three groups of people or what have you are going in and either approving or rejecting this. Now, after that, there are three sets of actions that can be executed. Approval actions, recall actions, and rejection actions. In other words, however this record ends up in terms of its end state, what are the things that we want to do once we've either been approved or rejected. So for example, if you remember the substatus field, remember it was set equal, we could set that equal to approved. One of the things we might want to do is in our approval actions have a field update and update the substatus to be approved so that now our record is marked as being approved. So then down the road we can run a report, or if we're create a view or whatever it may be where the recruiters are looking for things that are in the approved state, they'd be able to easily see those records. Okay. All right, I'm going to show you in the tool what we're going to do, but we're going to define the process definition itself, and then we're going to add initial submission actions. We're going to define the steps. We're going to then define the rejection, approval, and recall actions. What's a recall, by the way? Recall.
I was about to ask.
Oh, okay. You've heard of Gray Davis? So recall is when the submitter of the record decides that they'd like to recall it. So in other words, they realize that they need to change something. And instead of waiting for the people to go in and reject it, instead just recall it. Just take it, I'm rejecting it myself essentially. So take it out of the approval process and put it back into that
What if the approver is viewing it or accessing it?
Well, everything is, things aren't, if the person's looking at it, and then they click on the approve button, it's going to come back saying it's no longer in that state. So the key thing is that once we recall it, the next thing that occurs, even if the user had their web browser open, it'll then go, okay, it's no longer available for you to even approve. So each of those are discrete events that occur, and if one happens before the other, it invalidates the other. So if it's now approved, then we can't recall it. If it's recalled, we can't approve it. But they never happen simultaneously. Okay, so, all right.
Is that configurable? Can you disallow recalls?
You can, actually, yes. So it's not something you have to use. So, all right, so let's take a look at the way the tool works. All right. Our approval processes are created under create, and then workflow and approvals, and then there's an area called approval processes. Okay. Now, right off the bat, one of the things that you'll see is that there's a drop-down list asking you, well, what types of objects do you want to see approval processes for? So approval processes are linked to a specific type of object. So is this, my approval processes for positions, candidates, what have you. So there's no such thing as sort of a global approval process that applies to any record. It's unique per object type. Okay. So in my case here, mine defaults to position. When you go here for the first time, you're going to need to select position. If I had existing ones, then let me go out here and delete that. Oh, it's active. All right, I'll do that later. If I didn't have any, well, first of all, you see the ones that are available, the ones that are already defined. Now, if I wanted to create a new one, there's a couple of options here. There's the Jumpstart wizard and the standard setup wizard. The difference is that the Jumpstart is simple approval processes. They can never have more than one step. A lot of things are, not visible in terms of configurability. So the fully configurable one is the standard setup wizard, and that's the one that we're going to be using today. Okay. All right. So what you're going to do is you're going to, in the first steps, you're going to define the process itself. Now, not all of the information is entered into the process here. Later on, we're going to create actions and steps that are going to be associated with this process. Okay. So here, I'm going to call this one demo approval process. Okay. I'm going to click on my next button. It's going to prompt me for the entry criteria. The entry criteria, like I said, you could create multiple processes for a given object type, and a user might submit a record, and depending upon a value in the record, it might go to one approval process or another approval process. So you can inspect that record. In addition, if it matches on multiple ones, the reason we order them is so that whichever the first one it meets in terms of criteria, that's the one it will utilize. Okay. All right, so here I can do one of two things. Criteria or formula evaluates to true. So I could come in here and say this is for a position, so let's pretend for a second that this only applies when the department equals finance, something like that. Okay? So we can create one or many rules. By default, they're ANDed. Just so you know, the advanced options, this allows you to do the OR, if you want to do an or establish precedence with parentheses. Okay? All right, we're not going to do that, though. So I'm going to click on Next. All right, this is kind of a challenging thing because it says Next Automated Approver determined by, and then there's a drop-down list. Now, what this is referring to is the fields that would appear here are from the user object, and it's any field on the user object that's doing a lookup to another user. Okay. So on the user object, one of the things that exists is a manager field, and the manager field is a lookup to another user. Okay. So that's one of the standard fields that are available. And so one of the things that you can do is you can say, whoever the submitter is, use whoever their manager is one of the approvers. Okay. Now there's also this thing that says use the approver of the position owner. What this does is it says, okay, instead of using the instead of going to the record submitter and using their user account's referenced manager, instead go to the record owner, their user account, and use their manager. So if you have something where people submit on behalf of someone else or something like that, you could use the owner field, the owner field on the current record, and then use that user account in order to identify the approver. In addition to the manager, you could create your own custom field that does a lookup to the user, another user. So you could say, you know, designated position approver on a user object, and then use that field. Okay. So, but essentially that checkbox right there, use approver field of position owner, that flips it. So by default, it's the submitter. Now it's the owner. Two different people, not necessarily the same people. Okay.
How are you going to use you said that you can create another field for the approver and you can use it. How can we use it here?
So how can I, let me show you how we can do that. So you mean like on the user object, how can we?
Because in the options, you either select that manager of the owner, or you select this manager was a field in the user object.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
So if I click here on user fields, so one of the fields is manager. It's actually, it's called a hierarchy relationship. This only exists on users where it's a user-to-user lookup. So if I wanted to, I could create a new custom field on the user object. And what I could do is this hierarchical relationship. So the thing about so the thing about users is that users can do lookups to other users, but we can't use them like a standard or a custom object where, you know, we're doing master details or make a user, you know, associate users with job applications or something like that. I don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
How about role?
Role. Can we edit fields on roles?
No,
Create
can
custom.
we use them?
Can you use roles?
Yeah, instead of.
No, I don't think you can. There's no. Let's see. No, I don't think you can add fields to roles. For that matter, you can't add fields to profiles. So this is a user setting. Yeah, none of them appear here in the customize. So what I could do is create a new hierarchical relationship, and what did I say? Designated position approver, something like that. So now if I click on next, okay. So now here, there's now a custom field called designated position approver. So if I go out to my own user account, and I said that the designated position approver is Ben Stewart. Okay. So I've selected Ben Stewart. Now back in my approval process, I probably have to go back one and then let me refresh that. So notice now there's a field for designated position approver, custom field. So I could say that use that. Okay. Now ready? All right. Okay. There's a record editability properties. Only the administrator, in other words, only someone with modify all data can edit this record, or the current approver. So let's say that somebody submits a position and they go, the max pay is $100,000, and the person who's approving it goes, look, we don't have the budget for $100,000, it needs to be $80,000. So instead of rejecting it and saying you need to change this and then resubmitting it with a lower number, instead the current approver could just go in and go, okay, I'm just going to reduce the amount, I'm going to edit the record, reduce it down to 80,000, and then I'm going to approve it, or you know, sign off on it. Okay. So that's what that does. So administrators are the currently assigned approver. An email template, this is when we send emails to the approvers saying, please go out and, you know, perform this approval. We can create an email template and then reference this. Okay, I'm going to not do that. There's also this, when the user sees the approval in the web application, when they click on it, what data do we want to show to them? So I could come in here and say, well, relevant to this is the hiring manager field. It's also relevant to see the job description. And if they're going to approve it, they need to definitely know that max pay, something like that. Okay? So those are the fields which are going to appear when the user actually clicks on it in order to perform the approval in the app. Okay?
Is this new or it has been there before?
No, this is not new. Yeah.
No, does this have a page layout?
It's, I mean, this is, oh, does it have an official page layout? I don't think so. Let me, I don't think so. There's a way I can check. There's a little behind the scenes in the ID here. I don't think so. Yeah. Yeah, layouts are only for pages, because if I did, I would see it here. And there's no approval or something layout. These are all for different object types. So. All right, so it says display approval history information. I can check that box. What this means is that if I'm step 2, show me what step 1 did and who was step 1. Security settings, you basically can require the user to log into Salesforce, or you can allow them to approve it from a mobile device. One of the things that you can do is your users could, on their mobile device, respond back to an email with either yes, approve, or approved, or no, reject, or rejected. And that way, using their mobile device, they can respond back and save themselves the issue of or the step of going to the web browser. Okay.
Is that in the subject field or in the body?
In the body. It might accept both. Pretty sure it's the body, yeah. All right. All right, and then there's the issue of, well, who can submit it? Okay, so who are the people who can submit it? And one of the things we can do here is we can just go out here and say, for instance, the record creator can submit it. The record owner can submit it. People in this particular group can submit it. People in this role can submit it. People in this role and their subordinates can submit it. And then finally, a specific user can submit it. So this is all the different people that we would want to identify as being the allowed submitters of this. Okay? The checkbox for allow submitters to recall approval. So we can enable that or disable that. All right? So recall is actually new as of spring '09, I believe. So.
It's just a manual thing, right? Recalling. It's not automated process.
Excuse me?
Recalling is just a manual process, right?
Yeah, the user would go in and recall. Yeah, it's a manual process that they would do. Yeah. All right, so you get this at the end of this. So now I've defined the process. And at the end of this, it says, all right, well, now what do you want to do? Where do you want me to take you? So you could create an approval step. But what we're going to do is I'm going to say, no, I'll do this later. Take me to the approval process detail page. And then that way I get to see, so here's the process definition right here. And then I can add initial submission actions. I can add my approval, rejection, and then I didn't enable it, so there's not much sense in adding recall actions, but still. All these are workflow actions. So what are our 4 workflow actions? Task, field update, email alert, and outbound message. Okay. All right. So I could indicate, you know, for instance, I want to do a field update, and I might go, okay, I want to update the substatus, and I'd like to set this equal to pending. So once it goes into the approval process, change the status to pending. Once again, we could then later on run reports and find out, well, which of these are pending. Okay. Which records? All right. Same thing goes for approval actions and rejection actions. Okay, it's the same. You're just creating actions. The new approval step. Now this is where we identify our approval steps. So I'm going to call this demo approval step 1. Okay. And this is my first step. My steps can have entry criteria. We'll come back to this in a bit when we talk about how you can skip steps, but that's what it's for, is if you want to have an optional step, create entry criteria. Okay. This is an important part because we identify, well, who is the approver? Is it the, are we going to let the submitter just choose who it is? Okay. Are we going to use the user field that we identified earlier? Remember back on our process definition. We can assign it to a queue, in other words, a group of people who are going to do this. Then we can also assign it to, it says automatically assign to approvers, and I could select a specific user. And we'll talk about, we'll just leave it at that right now because we'll come back to this and talk about what if I had multiple rows. And what if I select something other than a user? There's also a related user, but like I said, we'll come back to that. Yeah?
In the case that you select a queue as the approver,
yeah.
Can you define that if at least one of them approves, then it can continue with the flow?
That option, see where it says when multiple approvers are selected? Approve or reject based on the first response or require unanimous approval. But that only applies to when you select multiples here. So if you select a queue, would it do first or unanimous? And let me check on that. I'm not sure what the default behavior is. There's also, it says the approver's delegate may also approve this request. Also on the user field is a, notice there's this delegate approver. So this would be on the manager's user record, right? So they would have someone who could take over for them or would be delegated to approve stuff. Okay. It's a standard field, yes. Yep.
You're saying it's on the managers? Right?
Well, it's not the delegated approver of the user submitting it. It's the delegated approver of the manager or the person who is, I'm sorry, not the, I'm thinking of like the manager of the, let me go back to this window. It applies to any situation up there, which is the approver's delegate may also approve this request. So whoever the approver is for this step, allow their delegated approver to do it. Yeah.
So how does it actually work? So the approver, either the approver or the delegates will approve it, or
Yes.
it actually
Only-
skips to the approver and just goes
Yeah.
to the delegate?
Only the approver will receive the email. The delegate will not, but when the delegate logs in, they can then go to their homepage and see they will also have ones that they could then click on in order to approve.
But how would he know that
The person, the delegate would not know. So the delegate would need to be told, you know, hey, delegate, I'm going on vacation next week. Can you every day go out and check the approvals? So there's not a notification being sent to the delegated approver, though. It only goes to the approver.
And either one can approve?
Either one can approve, yeah. So, yes.
Do we have a bypass? So, for example, I went to, I'm an approver, I went
Uh-huh.
on vacation,
Uh-huh.
and I forgot to delegate someone.
Uh-huh.
And now there's
Sysadmin.
an approver.
Yeah.
Or sysadmin.
Yeah, so that's, you know, once it's been, once it's been submitted, then, so if it's kind of stuck out there, then, yeah, let me verify that though. I believe the person who would be so if there's no delegate and the person is unavailable who is the approver, I believe the sysadmin can log in and then perform the approval for it. But let me verify that.
How about reassignment? Like, for example, I got fired.
Oh yeah. There's also let's see here. There's a reassign button. So let me get to the point where we show it in action, and then we'll talk about that. All right. Okay. So what we'll do is, let me see. I'm going to make myself the approver for the well, actually no. I'll make Andy the approver, and I'll log in as Andy. All right. So Andy is the approver. So I'm going to click on Save. All right. It says you can create approval actions or rejection actions for the step. So I'm going to click No. I'll do this later. And what I'm going to show you is that I now have one step, but if I click this Show Actions, I can create actions to perform after the step has been approved or rejected. Now, in addition, after the process has completed or been rejected, that's what these are referring to. So these are for the entire process, versus the ones above are for each individual step. Okay? So final approval action, you might do another field update. I actually have an existing one here I'm going to use. So here's my field updates. And how about update status to approved? Let's see here. There we go. That looks like it. And then let's create a rejection action. And my rejection action will be substatus to not approved. There we go. Need to do a little cleanup. All right. Okay, so in my case, it's very simplistic. I have a single action, but you could have multiple ones. Just define a new action, and then I have very few sort of submission actions in the approval and rejection. Okay. So any questions before I then jump into actually doing this? So, okay. So my let me also make sure that I'm going to edit who the initial submitters are, and I just want to make sure that I am allowed to do this. So, all right. Let's now, so we've created this. Now if I go back to my approval process list, there's one thing that I have not done, and that is I have not activated this. So I'm going to deactivate this, and then I'm going to activate my new one, which was my demo approval process. Okay. So now, when I have a position record, I can now submit it for approval. I just need to make sure it's a finance position, right? So if I go back to recruiting application, and then I click on, so let's see here, finance. There we go, senior technical instructor in finance. Now down here, there's a related list called approval history. This was added once I added my approval process. I can click on this button and then submit this record for approval. So it says once you submit the record for approval, you might not be able to edit it. So click on continue, okay. All right, because it was finance, I met my entry criteria. Okay. Otherwise, it would have said you did not meet the requirements of any of the processes, and it would have dumped me back out there. And then notice it says this. It says that it's pending. That's actually the status of the, not just the status of the approval, but also I set that field on the record. Now now one thing that's I'm a sysadmin, so I have the ability to reassign, but I also have the ability to approve or reject, but let's pretend I'm Andy now and I'm not a sysadmin. So now if I come back here and I click on, I'm going to click on setup so that I now may log in as Andy. So there we go, Andy. All right, so on, Andy would have received an email saying, please go out and approve this particular position. And this is what's going to appear on Andy's page, okay? So in this case here, Andy can reassign it, or Andy can approve or reject it. When I click on this, let's see here, let me make sure that make sure that Andy, actually I should have changed that to, oh, I can't change the reason. I should have changed that to approver since that's what Andy's doing. All right, so now if I log in as Andy, so let's see here, users, and then Andy, let's log in, approve or reject. Okay, now that I'm logged in, or now that I have record level access to that record, so now I can see it, and then I have the choice of do I want to approve or reject. Okay. And then there's also the link. You also see it on the record. So in this case, Andy could come in here. So I'm still logged in as Andy. Andy could come in here and reassign it to someone else. Okay? So if Andy wanted to do that.
You're in this process right now. The record is locked, right? Nobody can edit it?
Yeah. So notice that there's this lock here. So let's see what this does. So when I attempt to, as Andy, when I attempt to edit it, it says, no, you can't. Andy can't edit it. Now that being said, if I log out of Andy's account and I log in, so now I'm logged in as Chris. Chris is a sysadmin, so if I select that position, one of the things that I can do is I can edit this, okay, because I'm sysadmin, so Okay? Yeah.
You also mentioned that Andy will get an email on his inbox.
Yeah.
Did you have to set that up as one of the action item for the approval process, or is it an automatic from Salesforce?
It's an automatic function. You could specify that you want to use a template, but
So
other
even
than that,
if I do not set up a task or an action to
Yeah.
send out an email, it should still send out an email?
it's going to notify that person. Yeah. So you want to, I think what you're getting at is you'd like to check to see if that can be turned off. Is that where you're going with that?
No, I just didn't know it was already doing it without assigning an action.
Yeah. So it automates the sending of the email, I think. Yeah, I'm pretty sure about that, but let me, what I'll do is I'll try sending one of these to myself. I'll send one to myself. I'm pretty sure it does, but let me verify it. So, all right. So now Andy can come in here, and Andy can actually approve it or reject it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to log in as Andy, and what do you guys think? Thumbs up or thumbs down? So I can enter in some comments. So I reject this. All right. Well, what's going to happen is that now because of my field update, the substatus was set to not approved, but Andy, or whoever the person is who originally submitted this, they still have the ability, oh, Andy isn't sorry. They could come in here. Now it's no longer locked, so they could come in and go, okay, turns out that the pay grade needs to be accounting 200. So now, what did I do wrong? Responsibilities must have a value.
No, you have to change the status as well, or not?
Oh, yeah, probably want to, yeah. It's not necessary, but yeah. Well, it's going to get updated pending anyways. So now what I could do is go, okay, I've made my change, now I've reduced the pay grade or whatever it may be, and then now I can submit it for approval again. Okay. So it has a history. The history is that it got rejected, but now it's not like it's dead or something. I can now resubmit it, essentially. Okay.
Now, does the submitter get an email saying it's rejected? And again, you have to set that up on the action.
Let me check that out. Yeah. I'm trying to think. Have I gotten emails because of email alerts or the automated? Now you got me doubting myself.
Can you also like change a field to something else once it's rejected or once it's approved?
Well, it depends. So one of the things that when you're setting up your approval process, so if we take a look at the definition of the approval process, so notice down here there's a default action, which is record lock. Now here it says the record lock. So when the record is rejected, we're going to lock it, but we could also, or we're going to unlock it. But we could flip this and say lock it. So if you wanted to, you could change this default behavior. So by default, we say if it's rejected, unlock it. If it is accepted, then lock it. In other words, don't let the user make any more changes to it. Okay? All right? Okay. Any questions? Any more questions? All right, let's do this. I'm going to look up some of those questions I wasn't able to answer, and then we will work on the first lab exercise. You're going to create a position approval process, okay? And we'll devote some time to working on that. Why don't we do this? Since we're going to start a lab and it's 2:15, if you want to take some time over the next, we'll probably devote at least, probably devote 30 minutes. So over the next 30 minutes, if you want to stand up, grab a soda or whatever, go ahead and do that. Otherwise, we'll, sometime down the road, we'll do the next lesson. Okay? Okay. So I wanted to talk about some of the questions that were asked and address some of those that I was not able to answer. And then what we'll do is we'll cover the next topic, and we'll keep going, and then we'll put ourselves in a position to start the next lab exercise and move on to the next topic. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is if in a approval step that you assigned the approver to be a queue. I just tested that out by logging in as Phil Katz, who's a member of the recruiter queue, and I approved it, and it was immediately approved. So it was whoever the first person in the queue who approves it, as opposed to a unanimous wait for everyone in the queue to approve it. Okay?
But will others in the recruiter queue get notification that it's already approved, and
Yes.
they do not have to take any action?
They will get notified.
Okay.
Yeah. So the second thing was the auto email question, and I not only got notified when the what I did was I changed the email address of the person who was going to do the approval to my personal or my Salesforce email address. So here's the email that I received, which this is the one that is not using the email template. And so it's very basic, but just has the link that the user can follow to log into Salesforce to do the approval. Like I said, you can replace this with an email template if you want to, for instance, display some data associated with the record that's going to be approved, and so on and so forth. Do some HTML stuff.
What was the answer to the query? Because I was signing, I couldn't.
Oh, okay. What I did was I made the approver a queue and then logged in as a member of the queue and approved the record. And so I logged in as Phil Katz, and so I reassigned it to the queue, and Phil Katz approved it. And what it did was the logic was the first approver, so it's now approved. It did not require me to have all of the members of the queue approve it.
What if you change the option there?
That option only applies to, that does not apply to that setting. So if let me show you what I'm referring to. So in the setup menu under approval processes, and if we click on, so let's take a look at the step. So the ability to choose whether or not it's the first person to reply back or whether it's a unanimous vote is only available when you select the radio button assigned to approvers, and then you explicitly select specific users. Queue is not an option here, so you can't control it. So what I did was I reassigned it to a queue, and then in that case, it's not, it basically defaults to first user. Okay? The other question that came up was, can you disable the delegate for vacation? And I know you can go in, and if you wanted to, you could sort of go into your user account. So the manual way to do that would be to go into your user account, and then whoever the delegated approver was set to, just go in and get rid of that value when you're not on vacation. Otherwise, if you're using the delegated approver, there's no sort of on-off that's being utilized. That being said, I did find out on force.com there's an example. So current approvals engine does not route approval requests or emails to the delegated approvers. And then what this is doing is, it goes through an example where let me see if I can find the reference to the vacation stuff, but it talks about how you can, let me see, is this the...
second paragraph.
Yeah, here we go, thank you. So adding some custom fields like a vacation start date and a vacation end date, and then writing some Apex code to enable sort of that dynamic process by checking to see if the current date is within the vacation date. So I didn't go through this in great detail, but it looks like somebody out there, out on developer.force.com, they wrote some Apex code that would enable something very similar to what you were describing. I can't remember actually who asked that question. Lyra, was it you? Mauricio? Okay. So you could enable something like that with some Apex code. And if you go to developer.force.com and I searched for delegate approver, you can find that code, so, or at least a snippet of code. And then so any questions about that? So, okay. Auto email, so yeah, it automatically sends an email to whoever the approver is, and that was that email that I showed you that's automatically sent. I don't see a way to turn it off or make it somehow, I don't know, disable it in some way, but it's using the email address of whoever the user is, who is the approver.
So I noticed it's actually from whoever was the initiator.
Yeah, this is actually, this one is for the recruiter queue, and yeah, so here's yeah, so this isn't the best example, but a recruiter, the recruiter queue or a queue can have an email address associated with it to be notified, and so the email address is recruiters@universalcontainers.com. That's why that's there. And then Phil Katz is a member of that, and then I updated one of the users to have my email address, and that's why I appear on the to list. And then I guess it uses my email because I'm the one who submitted it. So the from is being determined by who is the person that submitted this for approval. So, all right, okay. All right, and then there was a feature that I just plain skipped. So back in the PowerPoint presentation, one of the things that I skipped was the view diagram. So the process visualizer, you can click on a view diagram button, and it generates a visual diagram of your approval process. It's a beta feature, so it's something that we're letting people take a look at. It's not, sort of officially supported. What they say, as you can tell with the link, have feedback, comment on this at the idea exchange. So this is kind of, I actually haven't really seen them do this kind of way of releasing a new feature. Normally they do an early access program. But maybe because we're just viewing these things, it's pretty harmless. But so yeah, you can click on that view diagram button. So when you take a look at your approval process, and let me go down to one that's a little bit more interesting and view the diagram. So it opens up this process diagram. Now, I think it's my understanding that they're gonna. This is just a first copy, and so eventually, someday, this might be an editor or something like that. I heard something about that, but future forward-looking statement. Do not hold me to that.
So in the future, you just draw it right like this.
Well, you might be able to do something where you, for instance, in this case, it's only for view, but I think the idea is that in the future you'd be able to come in here and go, okay, I want to edit this step or something like that, or
drag other tabs.
Yeah, or do something where it's a little bit more, where you're actually, setting up properties.
Microsoft Workflow Foundation.
Sorry, the.
Just like the workflow foundation.
Oh, okay. It does something like this, or.
Yeah, you draw it like this.
Yeah.
It creates the code behind.
Okay. Okay. So.
That is a industry standard notation too.
The is
what
this?
they're doing.
Oh,
It's
okay.
BPMN.
Oh, is it like an open source project or
Yeah,
something like
it's
that?
OMG.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. So, but you know, at the end of the day, out on the ID Exchange, you can provide feedback on this new feature. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about a few things, and then once again, we'll just allocate a bunch of time to working on labs. So skipping steps in an approval process. One of the things that you can do is define entry criteria for a specific step, and then what you would be enabling essentially is the ability to skip that step. Now, once there is a step after the step that you're editing, like in this screenshot, then you will have the option to go to the next step. So if we think about, yeah, we updated all these slides to do the process diagram, but now you can't read it. But there's 3 steps in the middle there, and do you see that bypass that where there's some step 2 criteria? It's probably really hard to see, but the idea here is that we're going to set this up so that the second, let me show you in the tool what this would look like. So the second step, what we'd do is we would say, okay, if the only enter this if the, where's the pay grade? Pay grade. If the pay grade contains, I think you guys have already done this at the end, but 300 or 400. In other words, we have pay grades where it's a number between 1 through 400, and if it, the idea is that 300 and 400 are high pay grade items. Therefore, if it is a high pay grade, then we need a VP to approve it. Otherwise, if it's not a high pay grade and it does not meet our requirements, in other words, it's a level 100 or level 200 pay grade, then let's simply go to the next step. Okay, in other words, let's skip this step. Okay, so this step is only necessary when it's a senior level position. Okay? And what you're going to do in the lab exercise is you are simply going to update your process so that you skip that step. So time-dependent workflow, let's talk about this. So time-dependent workflow allows us to do things like create follow-ups or reminders as a part of workflow rules. So let's take our quick review of workflow. So what does workflow do for us other than create follow-ups and reminders?
Automatic updates.
Yeah, automatic or immediate actions, right? Yeah. So what are the 2 methods for defining workflow criteria? There's actually, I would say that there's 3, but there's 2 different things that identify which records will execute the workflow rule. Do you remember what those 2 criteria were? Yeah, let's go back to Monday, right?
That was a long time ago.
Oh, Leah knows, but she's not going to share. Why don't you, okay, Leah, I think the class needs a lifeline right here.
A lifeline?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm thinking.
Does Leah need a lifeline?
I may need a lifeline. The time dependent
Yeah.
workflow. Right.
No, that's okay. That's that's a type. It's kind of generic here. Okay, so what I'm referring to is the entry criteria for the workflow rule. So there was the evaluation criteria, which was only when the record is created, or only when the record is created and edited, or only when the record is created or edited and did not previously meet the entry criteria. So there was those 3 evaluation criteria where we selected a radio button. In fact, normally I see people opening up the tool and then going, oh, what was that thing? And so, so this, yeah, exactly. You guys are all honorable, you know?
We follow the rules.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. So evaluate rule. So this is the, only when it's created or edited, and then when it's created or edited and did not previously meet the criteria. Okay? In other words, only fire it off once as a part of the, single workflow.
Those are 3.
No, that's so the evaluation criteria is one thing, and then rule criteria are the other. So now we're looking at a specific our data. So we're looking at the record, and we're then deciding, well, which records do we want to enter in here? So we might say, okay, if the duration in days is less than or equal to 90, then we want the record to enter into our workflow rule. Okay?
That was just a bad worded question.
Oh, that's probably, yes, we need to...
So that's evaluation criteria and rule criteria.
Yes, the evaluation criteria, yeah. And I lump both of those under my own made-up term, which is the entry criteria. So
My own.
that will not appear on the exam. All right. What are the 2 methods for defining workflow criteria? Well, the evaluation criteria and the rule criteria. What are the 2 parts of a workflow? So one of them is the criteria. What's the other one?
The actions.
What's that?
Actions.
The actions, exactly. So the actions that we want to perform. What are the 4 actions of a workflow rule? What are the 4 types? Field update, that's 1.
Email.
Task, assign a task.
Email
Email alert.
Outbound
Outbound messaging. All right, very good. Send an outbound message. All right.
So what's the difference between email and outbound message?
Email is, sending an email. Outbound message is, I don't need to define email for you. That's not the part you were struggling with. Okay, I got it. So outbound message is referring to a web services message. So the difference between an email and doing an HTTP post out to some external server. So, all right. I always go for the easiest half first. So, all right. Our workflow actions, they can be immediate, fire immediately, or fire after a certain amount of time. Okay. When we create our time-dependent actions, we're first going to create a time trigger. So we're going to say, here's a time trigger, which is going to specify when we want to execute that, when we want to execute the associated actions. What happens with a time, let me actually create one and then I'll talk about what happens. So if I go out here and I create one of these things, and so I'm going to go in here and I'm going to click that I'm going to, well, let's make sure, okay, I need to change this actually. So I'm going to do that. All right, I'll talk about why I needed to change that in a second. So down here I could add in a time trigger, all right? Now the date, you can do a number of days or hours after or before either the date that it was triggered or a date that appears, a date field that appears on the record. So you might say, you might have a field on your record called, send out reminder email or something like that, and then use that day and say, 0 hours before it or after or whatever, The most common thing would be to use the rule trigger date. In other words, after I execute my workflow rule, start a timer, okay? And 15 days later, 30 days later, whatever it is, perform the actions. Now the actions will only be performed if the record still meets the entry criteria. So let's think about what that means. So let's say that I have a, let's go back to our approval process. I submitted a record for approval, and now the substatus is equal to pending. One of the things I might do is create a workflow rule that says any position that is in pending for more than 15 days, let's send an email alert to someone, okay? Or let's do assign a task, whatever it may be, okay? If someone logs in and approves it, and now the substatus gets changed from pending to approved, or for that matter, rejected, we don't want to send the reminder saying, hey, you haven't done anything about the record, because they have. They've approved it or they've rejected it. So our entry criteria for the workflow rule was that the substatus was equal to pending. Now, I only want my actions to fire if it's still pending. In other words, if I still meet my entry criteria. Okay? Once the record is edited and no longer meets the entry criteria, it's no longer in the time trigger queue. It's no longer awaiting to be processed. Okay. Now, if you did happen to change it back to pending, it would then reset that time trigger from that point. Okay, it would not, like if you set it to, rejected after 8 days and then then resubmitted it on the 9th day, the time trigger, because mine is, in this case, it's 30 days after the rule trigger date, it's not going to start off on day 9. It's going to start off on day 1 and start over. Okay? All right. So that's why whenever we're talking about time trigger workflow actions, we're really talking about reminders and follow-ups. Something where somebody should have done something and they haven't. Okay? All right. All right, so I can create one of these things, and I'm just going to take the defaults. So 30 days after the rule trigger date, I can have multiple time triggers. So I could say I want to do something 30 days later, and I want to do something 15 days later, something like that. Okay? So you don't have to have just one time trigger. Now that I've created the time trigger, I can define what do I want to do. So maybe I want to send a new email alert. So I'm going to select email alert and then send email to Chris. That's creative. Okay, so now 15 days later, the whatever my entry criteria were, now we'll create a date equals less than or equal to today. So now send out that email saying, hey, you need to do something or whatever it may be. All right?
So would it keep looping every 15 days if you haven't done the
No.
You won't. So it will
No.
only do it once?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So if you wanted to do, there's not an endless loop, but if you wanted to have 3 reminders, create 3 time triggers at increments of your choosing. Oh, yes.
You have only one workflow per company, right? And you add as many steps as you need.
One workflow per company?
Uh-huh.
What do you mean by that?
That you don't define one workflow for this object and this workflow for this other object. You only have only one.
Oh no, you can have multiple workflows for the same object. So, oh yeah, definitely, sure. Yeah. Different situations, different reminders, different automation. Sure. So, yeah. Okay. Some considerations. Let's talk about the considerations. So, you cannot do the setting every time a record is created or updated if the workflow rule has a time trigger. Okay. Now the reason is that, think about that. We don't want a user to go in and change some text field for a description, and then suddenly we fire off another trigger. So now there's, let's say the user, it meets the entry criteria, and then the user goes in and happens to edit that record 5 times that day. Well, we don't want 5 reminders 15 days from now being sent out. So if you want it so that it fires when being edited, that's why we had that option. If we're doing time trigger, it's either only when a record is created or when a record is created and did not previously meet the rule criteria. In other words, once I have something in the time trigger queue, don't start adding in more. We only need one reminder, right? Okay. All right.
Would it fire if you did say every time a record is created and added?
It won't let you. So there's a problem here. So it's not going to let you do that. So let's see here. When a new workflow rule is created, it does not affect existing records. So in your database, workflow rules are triggered upon database write operations. So that's when they're evaluated. So there's something called the time-dependent workflow queue. So if you create one of these things, back down under monitoring is a time-based workflow queue. Now here, what you have to do is you enter in some criteria. Now you could enter in no criteria. But if I went out here, you could also filter essentially by the workflow rule name or the object equals position, something like that. So you can filter this list. But this is going to show you, okay, here are all the pending actions that are going to be performed. And so here's this one, position has no interviewers. And the scheduled date is the 17th of July. Okay, so that's when that one's going to fire. Now, I could check out the entry criteria, then click on the record and change the entry criteria and prevent that from executing by having it not meet the entry criteria. Okay? All right.
So you're manually taking out.
Yeah, so I mean, my point was that I could either go in here and edit the record so that it no longer meets the entry criteria, or actually I could select and then manually, as a sysadmin, I can actually manually remove things from the queue.
For the time dependent.
For the time dependent stuff.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's one of the things sysadmins have the ability to do is to delete these pending actions. Okay?
Where is that again?
Right there.
Sorry,
Oh.
to get there.
Oh, okay. So down here under monitoring and time-based workflow. Okay? So it says here, this is a long-winded way of saying what I just said. So if a record that has an action pending against it in the time-based workflow queue is modified so that the record no longer meets the criteria, the action will be updated in the queue. I'm not sure what they mean by the timing changes, but by saying updated in the queue, in other words, we're gonna remove it from the queue. It's no longer meeting the requirements of the queue. Okay. All right. So some examples of things to do, and this is what we're going to be doing in the labs actually. So if a status of an offer is sent, so we send out an offer to a candidate and we haven't heard back in 2 days, maybe we assign a task to the recruiter. Hey, you need to follow up with this person. Okay. If the number of interviewers associated with position is 0 after 30 days, email the hiring manager. If a critical position remains open for more than 14 days. So if it's critical, it shouldn't be open for so long. So somebody should do something if it's critical. So, all right.
So for the approval process,
Sure.
can we use that reminder? So if someone doesn't approve within
Yeah.
30 days.
Exactly. So remember that the substatus of pending?
Mhm.
So let's have our workflow criteria be
So
substatus
you can add
equals
workflow
pending.
to the approval process.
No, it's independent, but because the initial submission action on the approval process would change the substatus to pending, then we'd meet the requirement of our workflow rule. It would then fire off the time trigger and say 10 days later, or whatever, send an email update. Okay? Let's compare. So workflow, in my opinion, workflow, a lot of people kind of get a little bit, I think they get confused about workflow and approvals because they both use actions, the same actions. But to me, workflow automates. And approval processes are kind of the opposite. So they don't really, I mean, it's an automated process, but it requires users to do something. Whereas in workflow, if we're doing immediate actions, it removes the necessity of users to do stuff. With an approval process, it requires that users do stuff. Okay? Now they're both process automation. I think they both fall into that process automation umbrella, but they do two different things. One is, yeah. And you can use them in conjunction with each other. Like I just explained, you know, with the whole example we just talked about there with the pending substatus.
For more information on Salesforce.com training and certification, please visit www.salesforce.com/training.